Curating Climate. As co-director of ONCA, an arts and environment organisation, the theme of this panel struck a chord with me. Curating climate and biodiversity was what ONCA founder Laura Coleman set out to do in 2012, when she set up a small urban art gallery focusing on environmental issues. Laura, a white middle-class arts graduate and writer from Brighton, had been deeply affected by her experiences working as a volunteer in a wildlife refuge in the Bolivian jungle. And she wanted to make a space for sharing stories such as those that she'd found there. I fell in love with the project straight away, as many have. But I'm not here to sing ONCA's praises. I'm here to talk about its journey through action, making mistakes, being curious, failing, enduring, failing, reflecting and attempting to stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway would put it, as a small arts charity. I think it's a hopeful example of how an organisation can learn and develop as a supportive community, encountering pitfalls and navigating them to shape the organisation increasingly intentionally in the context of climate crisis and its structural drivers. ONCA came from a visceral dissatisfaction with the hierarchies of white-walled gallery spaces, but it did reproduce some of these, and it's worth exploring how and why, with a view to arguing for the possibility of transforming or decolonising an organisation with colourblind roots. I'm mainly interested in how a critical awareness of power, privilege and positionality make for better environmental work. Tema Okun and Kenneth Jones's list of the characteristics of white supremacy culture and their antidotes is very helpful for understanding the historic tendency of white liberal arts advocates and environmental activists to set off on an exclusory footing. This list is a list of common behaviours and assumptions that serve to maintain power structures, centralising power and inhibiting the emergence of new forms of power and collectivity. And the characteristics include things like individualism, urgency, assumed objectivity, defensiveness, paternalism, perfectionism, and others. I would also argue that by extension, these characteristics of white supremacy culture, so familiar and so entrenched and not necessarily experienced as the tools of white supremacy, underlie the behaviours that drive the systems and paradigms that drive climate change. Let's take urgency. I would say urgency is a defining feature of capitalism, that drive to produce and consume. But it's also very familiar in the environmental movement, the mainstream environmental movement. It was this sense of urgency, this impulse to do something in the face of devastating statistics and rapid change that gave ONCA life, but also that made it problematic. This urgency frequently underlies white-led environmental projects and colourblind environmental arts, which can worsen the issues they seek to address by rushing to solve problems and failing to include a consciousness of structural equality or to value the importance of process and plurality of voices. And how about paternalism? ONCA initially did have a whiff of paternalism or white saviorism in that it aspired to do things like help conservation efforts without asking who is conserving what, why, whose perspectives are being listened to, what are the priorities of the project, and so on. We wanted to host conversations about structural power, but we didn't name structural power as ubiquitous, and we didn't own our own structural power or consider how as an institution we reproduce those structures. Take our branding. The decision to centre an animal rather than the indigenous environmental protectors in whose care that animal rests in ONCA's branding and storytelling is an example of a failure of our language around biodiversity that we've sought to redress. It was a deeply personal decision for Laura that stemmed from the relationship she'd formed with a puma whilst in Bolivia. However, the question remains, why did Laura choose to centre the story of a puma over the stories of those humans working every day for environmental justice? Because she was told by her peers and fellows in the art world, audiences want to hear stories about animals, not people. By implication, of course, that's certainly not brown people. She didn't question it. We were timid about the value of our own voices, our lived experience, and the perspectives of other non-experts. We've been educated in systems that fetishise writing, to think that all the answers are in books written by professionals and experts. We bought into the myth of objectivity, pedestalising experts who were mostly white, mostly men, mostly older, highly educated in salaried roles. We asked them to volunteer their time to talk to us, and this was doable for people in employment or people who could afford to invest volunteer energy into developing their work or supporting the organisation. Because ONCA was unfunded, or more precisely self-funded through savings, our talks programme consisted of volunteer speakers and artists, which obviously limited the demographic pool of people who could participate. And on volunteerism, in the early days, art flooded in response to our open calls for works, and yet hardly any artists were paid. Few works were sold. Artists were expected to submit only professionally framed pieces and to pay for the postage of the works. We did play on the notion of the gallery as aspirational, and of the artist needing the gallery, that hierarchical power dynamic and that curatorial privilege. And few of the pieces that we exhibited connected non-human and human. As environmental arts curators, we were not thinking intersectionally, and this made for an absence of stories focusing on people's lived experiences, and again, risked erasing humans from our storytelling. But before too long, we were able to articulate that this was problematic. The 2015 Warwick Commission report, which found that a tiny percentage of the UK population engages with the arts, made us step back and focus on finding out about our audiences rather than proselytising. The pause helped, but it did not complete the task of steering ONCA towards a clear language around how white supremacy and structural inequality drive environmental breakdown, and how an ethos of solidarity and justice is the only sensible grounding for transformative environmental action. In 2016, Trump and the Brexit vote triggered an existential crisis for ONCA, and we finally took inspiration from Audre Lorde, laid down our tools and started really listening. At last, we saw whiteness as an organising principle. We could behold and name at last how ONCA's initial curatorial approach had been based on problematic, tacit assumptions arising from the lack of an anti-racist lens, with whiteness invisible and unexamined by the curators and the artists involved. And since then, ONCA has continually had to consciously correct course as whiteness, alongside and intersecting with economic and class privilege, presses in again, again and again. And things continue to get worse as these structures continue to wreak harm. The Earth's biological and cultural diversity are being devoured, and positive feedbacks are hastening climate breakdown. Awareness raising and education are not enough. Information, facts, the appeal to the rational, to objectivity, the right or wrong binary, these are not enough. The use of statistics, shame and horror is not transformative. It is a tool of the mainstream media that risks making people feel helpless and disaffected. Activists of colour have been critiquing white supremacy in the environmental movement for years. They experience its backlash in the form of denial and sidelining or co-option, not to mention widespread overt hate. But thanks to their labour, conversations about racism have moved forward in the media and in mainstream activism recently. Few arts or environmental organisations now dispute that structural racism is a problem in the sector, as well as across society, although often there is a disjunct between rhetoric and practice wherever anti-racism is not centred in planning and organising. It is hard to stay slow and thoughtful in the context of runaway ecological collapse, trying to stay grounded and locally relevant, trying to keep our language and activities accessible. The need for integrity of process can mean that less overt work or production happens, and this can be hard when we need to raise money to survive. Also, the issues we focus on can be difficult for the ONCA staff. For example, running workshops on environmental racism is painful and possibly dangerous, and unevenly so. From my own experience, I go through perfectionism and self-judgment. I want to get things right, I want to please, I want to know the answers. And then when I make a mistake or hurt someone, I bounce away into paralysis or depression. My own white fragility and the white fragility of other white people, perfectionism, the expectation of comfort, the aversion to conflict, these can all be barriers to a learning culture. And staying with the trouble is not easy. We have to remain alert to the news and politics and to participate in all sorts of forums to ensure that there is a space for climate justice consciousness in arts and environment sector conversations that we're part of. But if we don't do it artfully, this can make us the boring ones, the ones who make the atmosphere in a room turn awkward. Balancing levity, play, pleasure and fun with gravitas is an art and a political act in itself, as described by Nicole Seymour in her book Bad Environmentalism and Adrienne Marie Brown in Pleasure Activism. The role of the arts must be to make spaces for complexity, paradox, plurality. And to do this, arts organisations need to be critical, self-reflexive spaces. ONCA has evolved into a supportive learning community, inspired and led by voices from the front lines of environmental and social injustice. We try to use our community and its power, along with its voices, and the experiences and privileges of the people in it to celebrate and amplify work that points forward from white supremacy culture. We try to act in solidarity and to constructively critique projects that reproduce coloniality and patriarchy. Over time, the work and voices of environmental defenders in many communities, including the one where Laura volunteered, have moved from the margins of ONCA's storytelling to the centre. For example, our most recent exhibition, extractingus.org, explores extractivism in a range of contexts from a feminist perspective. It's an ongoing collaboration with researchers in the Wellbeing, Ecology, Gender and Community International Research Network. And putting the exhibition online responds to the need to continue critical conversations around the political ecologies of extractivism in and beyond the COVID-19 health crisis. It includes contributions from artists, activists, scholars, communities and organisations working in contexts of extractivism around the world. Its curatorial approach aims to disrupt common spectacular aesthetics and north-south narratives on extractivism. It includes stories of resistance and agency rather than pathos. ONCA's work, Curating Climate, is always emergent and evolving through dialogue, reflection and relationships. It's great to be part of this conference and I hope to be in further conversation with some of you.